we're not talking about gazillion dollar funding initiatives. Even the current initiative that you have that we'll get to here in a bit around women's health. I was surprised to see what the goal was. It wasn't $10 bazillion.
Do you want to be better with money but dread the math? I get it. That's why this show is not focused on math, the markets, meme stocks, or even economic predictions. It is focused on how money fits into your daily life, from having healthy money conversations to caring for an aging parent. I'm Karen Coyne, certified financial planner professional and your host of Money Without Math. Join us for conversations that are practical, sometimes philosophical, and always fresh. Learn more about me at raymondjames.com/clarity and be sure to subscribe.
What does it take to live not just longer, but to live better? Today, I'm joined by Joshua Herring, CEO of the Longevity Science Foundation, to explore the rapidly evolving science of healthy longevity, the role of philanthropy in accelerating breakthrough research, and why women's health may represent one of the most overlooked opportunities for both impact and innovation. The common thread across these three topics is that investing in the future, not just as an investor, but through purpose-driven giving, can shape the quality of life for future generations to come. Welcome, Joshua.
Thanks so much for having me on, Karen. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, I am just so excited to have this conversation with you because longevity is a huge topic right now. And of course, as you know, spans a very wide variety of topics. And also the work that you're doing and the organization that you're doing it with is so unique. So instead of me trying to explain it, why don't we start right there? Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm certainly biased, but I think it's one of the most fulfilling and most incredible things that I at least can be doing with my time. So the Longevity Science Foundation really is a super simple organization. We are connecting intention to impact for individuals, for families, for researchers, for all of us in ways that are transparent, in ways that are efficient, and in ways that are unique, like you mentioned, and bespoke. And so, who we are is a research funder. We go into academic labs and early stage businesses inside of life sciences and biotechs that are just asking the simple question, how do we get people to live healthier for longer? And we accelerate research. But what's really important and unique about us is that we do so at a time when no other funders are really willing to step in. We're doing so early. We're helping to de-risk the theses. We're helping to bring about innovations that will ultimately become commercial and then attract later stage investment. We're taking some risks, some calculated risks, of course, but we're really willing to work with researchers and the most brilliant people all across the planet in helping us get a better understanding of what this life is and how healthy and how long it can really be. And at the same time, giving people on the other side of that equation, right? The people with the gas to put in the tank, if you will, an opportunity to really drive impact in a way that's meaningful to them as an individual or as a unit. And so that's what I really love about the work that we do. We're not the type of organization or nonprofit where you write us a check and we come back in 12 months and ask you for another one. We are the type of organization where we really try to work with you to understand what's important to you, Karen. Where do you want to make an impact? And how can we be a thought partner and a consultant and a guidepost in making sure that you do so in the way that works best for you?
And and you touched on this. A lot of what you're doing is different from what other organizations and researchers are doing or what's happening in healthcare because those areas are typically focused on treatment and care as
Yeah.
opposed to prevention.
Yes, exactly. So the statistics are really staggering. And I'll do my best not to bore folks too much with numbers during this entire conversation. But generally speaking, prevention focused research, at least in the United States, gets less than 10% of funding.
Crazy.
And in reality, it's really closer to 5%. So if you think about it, for every $100 whether you're spending it on personal health care or there are researchers trying to unlock innovations, 95 of those dollars are going towards treating diseases that have happened to people. How do we make the experience of that disease more manageable, more painless, smoother, easier to deal with, and increase quality of life once the disease has manifested? And that's really, really important work. Both of my parents are cancer survivors, and they would not be alive today if that work was not done. And so I'm very grateful for that. But there's a tremendous asymmetry that exists. We can't have the lion's share of funding, whether it be towards the healthcare delivery system or whether it be towards the research activation, go towards treatment. So that 5% in prevention and prediction, trying to get an understanding of why diseases manifest in the first place. Why do we age? Why is that process so rapid? And is it possible to either slow it or prevent the onset of a number of diseases like Alzheimer's or diabetes or cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis? The list will go on and on. But that's the approach that we take. We operate in that 5%. And ultimately, the work that we're trying to do is to right size that allocation, to put it in financial advisory terms, right? How can we get a better um, and a more equitable distribution of funds moving towards preventing all of these really harmful outcomes from happening in the first place, to then ultimately treating them and dealing with them in the case that they do. But our work, I think, is a bit more optimistic for human life in our approach, right? We're not assuming that we're going to get all of these things. We're fighting really hard to make sure that we don't. And then if we still do, we have tons of technologies on the back end that can make the management and the treatment of those diseases, much better. But that's why in our three verticals that we focus on as an organization, the first of which being the biology of aging, the second of which being chronic and age-related disease, and the third of which being women's health, everything that we do is focused on prevention and prediction, really trying to make sure that as we're on this journey to not just add more years to life, but adding life to those years and improving quality of life, we are doing our fair share in stopping the damage, which is physical and emotional. By the way, not just for the individuals that contract these diseases and have this aging process, but to those around them as well in the healthcare system at large. How can we do our fair share in making sure that we are investing efficiently, and appropriately to take care of that population as well?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a huge undertaking. And the other unique part of your organization is that 100% of the dollars donated get put to work.
100%. 100% of the dollars do. So for every dollar in, that's a dollar out that we fund research with. We're in a blessed position to be able to do that. That's a unique structure that we have, and it's afforded to us by some very generous donors that cover all of our operational expenses and costs, from our venture capital founders that created the organization. So it's a responsibility at the same time, and it's one that we share with all of our other donors, right? When you give to an organization, you might assume that 100% of the funds will actually land boots on the ground right towards the impact. But organizations have operating costs, and it's important that we pay them, right? Because otherwise that good work won't be done anymore. So that's a super critical component. But with us, we have this structure so that as an individual, Karen, your donation, you feel with absolute confidence that 100% of it will go directly towards the cause that you care about. So we're in a bit of a unique spot, but one that I'm certainly happy about.
Yeah, the last thing I'll mention that is unique is that we're not talking about gazillion dollar funding initiatives. Even the current initiative that you have that we'll get to here in a bit, around women's health. I was surprised to see what the goal was. It wasn't $10 bazillion. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so accessibility, I think, is a cornerstone of our organization in more ways than one. On the one hand, and from the researcher perspective, we only fund work and we only fund research that has the ability to impact everyone, that it pertains to. Not a certain population of people broken out by wealth or by geography, but everyone, right? So for who we are, and in our mission, it's not just extending healthy quality of life for some, but truly for all, right? It's a right, we believe. And the same is to be said for those who want to contribute to the cause. We're not asking people to write away their checks or their incomes. That's not fair. And it shouldn't fall on individuals to feel that responsibility to do so either. What we are doing is investing at a stage where, truthfully, not a lot of capital is required for a completely outsized return.
Hmm.
Typically, $200,000 for these projects through the 3 to 4 years that it will take to fund them will really move them along super significantly. And that's something that people are surprised to hear, but fond of hearing because it means that there's a much more accessible point that they can come in and make an impact. But the other thing is that this is a movement, right? And so it's not just you funding it, Karen, it's you and me and all of the other donors in our network that we do know and all the others that would like to come on and join for our initiatives as well. So that's what we very intentionally choose the limits of when we raise, how much we're raising for. We don't need $25 million in order to unlock innovation. We need a few hundred thousand at a time for each of these projects. And so when we think about building portfolios together, that's why we structure it very intentionally to make sure that everyone, irrespective of how much wealth they command, has an ability to make an impact that feels meaningful to them.
Yeah, that's super encouraging. I've been a member of a women's giving circle, for example, and the whole idea is that when we pool our resources together and direct them at, causes where there's a common interest, we can be more impactful than, I give 25 here and I give 25 there. We're pooling our resources and then targeting them in a way that we can make an impact.
Exactly. And that's the mission, right? Because I think longevity is something that we all want, number one. And so if it's something that we all want, it's something that we should all be able to play a role in. And the idea of pooling resources is tremendously effective. If I go out and I find 200 people from all across the world to just give $1,000, that means one full project will be funded. $200,000 right there. And we're not asking anyone to, create a large endowment or give us their entire retirement portfolio or put a bequest in their will for the foundation. We're saying take a slice of whatever your philanthropic giving is, trust us and trust the others around you to make a collective difference, while still giving access and accountability and equity, really, to everyone that's involved in that process.
Yeah, combined, very unique. I mean, just very unique in the nonprofit space between the 100% going to work, the level of the initiatives, and the preventative focus. So, love to see this. And really, it's like how did this not happen sooner? But that's a whole separate conversation. That's a whole separate conversation. And people probably already have a sense of why and how. But let's talk a little bit about longevity because that of course is at the core of what you do. What do you think is most misunderstood about longevity science?
Well, I'll give you two things, because I think that it's so multidimensional. First, I think when people hear about longevity, they think about radical life extension. They think about a quest for immortality. They think about a futuristic living until 500 years old. That's not really what longevity is, and that's certainly not what we're going for at the foundation. If that's what you're interested in, I know a great group of folks that are doing that work, but that's not the work that we do, right? And so there's this big misconception between lifespan extension and what's known as health span extension, the healthy number of years that you live. And that's really what longevity is about. It's a combination of those two things. Before we get to immortality, we first have to figure out how do we stop people from getting cancer and Alzheimer's and dementia. And so if you're living for a longer time, you need to be living healthier for a longer time as well. And there's a big imbalance there, which is a longer conversation, but we're living longer as a human population, but the healthy number of years is actually decreasing.
Hmm.
And so that lifespan to health span gap is widening. And so it's part of the work of the foundation to really close that. And it's widening fairly quickly in the United States as well. So that's the first, misunderstanding, I would say. The second misunderstanding, I think, is that this is a pursuit that is exclusively meant for the ultra high net worth,
And
or there are super high barriers to entry. That's also not necessarily the case. I am not naive enough to think that frontier and niche technologies are inexpensive. They certainly are, and they can be. Economies of scale and continuing to do research and all these other sorts of things will bring those costs down over time. We're just behind in the game, which is why some of the things that are available today do have such a hefty price tag next to them. But the true pursuit of longevity is a core and humanistic pursuit to get every single person on this planet living healthier for longer. And so this is one approach of doing so, right? But there's also hunger. There are folks without homes. So there are a number of things that we have to tackle simultaneously in order to do that. What we're working on is the biology, which is a really integral component. And then hopefully once we sort of solve this equation, all of the others will fall into place as well by necessity. But I would say those are the two misconceptions. It's not all about lifespan and living forever, and it's not just about therapies that cost $250,000 a quarter.
Okay, that's very encouraging to hear also. Now, you formerly worked on my side of the desk doing similar work as a wealth advisor, managing a very successful team. Tell me, you just mentioned biology. If you're successful and your researchers are successful and uh, we're able to have these breakthroughs in longevity, and these come sooner, let's just say they come sooner rather than later. How do you think that will impact, for example, the work that I do, the work that or people who are out there saving for retirement? How is all that going to impact retirement and how people live and save for longer lives?
Well, it's a really good question for a number of reasons, but particularly because it will come sooner than a lot of folks are expecting. We're not that far away from a lot of breakthroughs, particularly in women's health. We just need to invest the right way. And so this has been the case for a while, quite honestly. It's just taken a lot to drive the movement in a direction where we are deploying capital more effectively. But let me just answer the question. Um, if you're living for a longer number of years, right? And so let's say the average age goes from 80 to 100. That means that you've got 20 additional years on the back end where you'll need assets to sustain your lifestyle, to cover expenses, expected and unexpected, to take a vacation, to fix the roof on your house, to pay for healthcare, right? So when you have that many years that are being added, and healthy years, importantly, you want to be able to still live life. You don't just want to be here. And so you need to actually think about how can you bolster your retirement portfolio and build it up more, and then perhaps think about at what point you start to de-risk and bring some of those more aggressive growth assets off of the table in order to preserve it for a longer period of time. And so I think folks really need to start thinking about how much they're spending up until retirement and perhaps saving a bit more. I certainly think that that's the number one thing. But something that financial advisors should be thinking about as well is what those conversations are really going to look like. How do you want to spend your time in your later years? Assuming you had more time on earth, what would you really want to do with it? What are the things that are really important for you? What do you want your legacy to be? But also, how do you want to engage with society for your duration on this planet? Um, the long short of it, Karen, honestly, is I think folks will need more money. And that's sort of a sad and frustrating thing to say on the one hand, because that's a quest that folks undertake for their entire lives anyway. But if you're going to be living longer, you certainly do need more assets in order to protect yourself throughout that time frame. The additional layer of complexity that I won't get into right now is that healthcare costs, if we're successful, will also come down a bit. A lot of the reason why healthcare in the United States is so expensive is because we have a massive burden of care here. Diseases of all sorts impact a large percentage of our population. We're not actually to get people healthy again. And so they sort of are in this recidivism of sickness, which is not a good state to be in. So that's why healthcare costs are so high. We can prevent people from getting sick in the first place and keep them healthier for longer. Global, but certainly United States healthcare expenditure will come down. So there is a bit of leveling of the scales in that regard, but not enough to not plan for it effectively on the front end.
It's certainly multidimensional, and wouldn't we all love to see healthcare costs come down? So
I certainly would.
I know. I feel like I could own a private island by now for what I pay and have been paying for healthcare as a small business owner. which is very frustrating, especially because I, try to do all the things, eat right, get my sleep, get my sunshine. Uh, the thing I think about too, when I think about living longer and the well span, like you talked about, is also maybe the difference in how we think about spending our money, that we, especially for those that are already doing all the right things, they are saving, they're on track, feeling or seeing it as an investment to like buy the good salmon, buy the fresh vegetables, invest in a social activity that you really enjoy and spend dollars doing those things that ultimately are also very positive for your healthy aging.
Yeah, I mean, I think about all of those things as well. I think that, um, you know, what's interesting about all of this longevity science that we're unlocking on our end is that it's hardcore technical biological research. But what we know about longevity is that your sleep, your stress, your exercise, your diet, and a couple of other things really at this stage have the most deterministic value on your length of life and your quality of life, how much alcohol you drink, whether you smoke or not, right? So all of these controllables. So it is a tremendous investment to choose to do each of those things the right way. Quite frankly, not everyone has the luxury of that choice, but if you do have the luxury of that choice, it's one of the best investments that you could possibly make. It will cost a little bit more though, right? And so how do you right size your own personal spending allocation to make sure that you're planning effectively for each of those things? It sounds like you do it. I certainly do it. My grocery bills are quite high. So I take down from some other points in my life, but the quality of my food is really important to me because I know of the detriments when quality of food is poor, right? And
Hmm.
so it's absolutely an investment.
Yeah, I feel like I always want to temper advice because the folks who are already doing a really good job of saving money and this whole longevity conversation, I feel like is injecting even a little bit more anxiety to the people who are already prone to it because it's like, oh my gosh, I thought I had to save a lot. Now I have to save even more. And you do potentially, but also I think and this is probably a whole separate conversation too, separate podcast conversation, but I think it also calls for us to look at how we're spending right now because it's connected to our habits and how we're living right now that will promote the healthy aging. So before we get totally off track with that, though, I do want to make sure we talk about what you think is the difference between just say general, well-intentioned giving versus really high impact philanthropy.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that the if I had to distill it down into one word, I would say accountability. Um, how accountable are the organizations that you're giving to you as an individual? How confident are you that your generously donated dollars are being used in the way that you would want? And so, to be fair, you leave the dirty work up to the experts, right? If someone is recommending, hey, we need to do this with these funds, and they're really good at that allocation, I would trust them. But how accountable are they in reporting to you what they're doing with your dollars? How much confidence do you have that your money is actually going towards the boots on the ground as opposed to, covering salaries or some of these other things? Again, all of which are really important. But it's difficult to know. And there's not a lot of transparency in this industry, which is a big frustration of mine, which is why we structured our organization in this very particular and unique way, where we tell you exactly not you're giving to us, you're giving to accelerate this project that's doing this thing at this lab in this geography. And here are the quarterly updates from these researchers. And here's the annual update. And by the way, please come and meet this research team so you actually can engage with the folks with their boots on the ground. And so that accountability layer, I think, is really critical. It's a tough one for folks to parse out, and organizations typically don't make it easy for you to do so. But I think general well-intentioned philanthropy is I really want to make an impact, and so I'm going to give money. Really high impact philanthropy is I want to make an impact in a specific way that I've really teased out. And this is the exact way that I'm going to do so. These are the metrics, these are the KPIs, this is the time frame, and I have a communication channel to be able to ensure that whatever was promised is actually being done.
Joshua, why is there such a funding disparity when it comes to women's health?
That's a really good question. I feel like many of us know the answer, but sometimes it's helpful to really explain how, generally speaking, health sciences and life sciences research funding actually happens, and then I can add some commentary about women's health as well. So there are really four players that can fund research and that do fund research. You have governments, so think of the NIH. You have commercial investors. So think about family offices sometimes who have maybe a focus on biotech and life sciences. Think about venture capital funds. Think about private equity companies. You have academic institutions themselves. Whatever the academic institution is, their biology department or their medical school, they have an investment portfolio, and so they can deploy. And then you have philanthropy. So of those four levers, philanthropy is called on the most, activated the most frequently, and talked about the least. I think you see the name of an individual on the side of a building and you go, oh, that's really nice. They must have made a $100 million gift and maybe not even thought about that and kept moving, just asking yourself who that person is. But let me tell you why three of these players are less efficient than I think we'd like for them to be. So governments, and let's just forget about what's happening with NIH funding right now, right? Because I think it's a poignant example, but it happens completely outside of this too. Governments are forced to deploy resources that meet the need of the country, right? And so in the United States, where the burden of care is so high, and you have so many people that deal with diseases today, the government is forced to invest in making sure that people with those diseases have the resources and the treatment that they need. So that's why there's such a large disparity between prevention and treatment, just with using the United States as an example. We can't deploy 50% of our assets towards prevention when such a large percentage of our population is sick. Um, Academic institutions, while they have those resources, they typically invest commercially in order to grow them for the benefit of their school and for their programs, right? And so early stage research, which is not yet commercial, you can't reap a return from it. It's really difficult for you to actually get some kickbacks from that later down the road. So academic institutions bring in researchers and ask them to go fundraise for their own research using the name and the pedigree of the institution as opposed to the funds from that institution. And by the way, sometimes they'll ask for those researchers to go out and find funding for their individual salaries as well. So really few dollars are given to the folks that are there at the schools doing the good work. Um, Family offices and venture capital funds, again, typically when you're thinking about it, are going after commercial return. VCs and private equity companies have investors and shareholders that they're beholden to, and they have time frames with IRR metrics that they need to meet. Family offices are sometimes certainly very philanthropic and have large foundations, but for the most part looking to grow their familial assets as well. And so with each of those three players, there is an asymmetry in the early stage nature of the research, the commercial availability of deploying a dollar today. What can you get from that in a couple of years? And sort of the burden of care and the need for an institution or a governmental entity to deploy funding into research for what specific kind and within what subsector of life sciences and biomedical science. And so what you're left with is philanthropy, individuals that feel drawn to a cause, individuals that are passionate, individuals that are sick and tired of waiting on all of these other players to make change and decide to be the change that they want to see. And so that's why it is so underfunded and oftentimes unfunded. Longevity, which is really popular right now, is actually not new. It's been around for 30 years. This understanding of biological aging and seeing whether it's a process that's either slowable or preventable. But it just doesn't get a lot of attention because not many folks feel very personally connected to living forever, right? But that's why this isn't a conversation about immortality. This is not a conversation about living until 500. It's a conversation about, my parents who had cancer. How can we, uh, how is it possible to prevent another child's parents, both of them, from having cancer? How is it possible to prevent your sister from having Alzheimer's? How is it possible to do X, right? That's the philanthropic nature of what this work really entails. And so that's the population of people you're left with. And so unfortunately, the burden is put on all of us collectively, but we are strong together. And so that's why there's so much funding asymmetry, but with more conversations like these, with other players doing work like the Longevity Science Foundation, and with us continuing to do the good work that we do, eventually we will really balance the scales.
Yeah, I hope that we also see that sooner rather than later because it's crazy. I mean, even just using menopause as an example, there's so much I've learned because I'm going through it now in the past few years that I'd never heard my entire life. And now it's so funny because when I'm talking to a woman who's my age, for example, and she's complaining about her shoulder, I'm like, oh, you maybe have frozen shoulder. Do you know what that is? And they're like, huh? What? And it's just, there's so much territory to be covered. So yeah, I applaud you and the foundation and all the work that you're doing. We could talk
Thank you.
for hours. I mean, there's so much to go. We've barely scratched the surface today, Josh, but want to thank you for joining us. And we will certainly share links to your LinkedIn as well as to the foundation so people listening can learn more about all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me on, Karen. It's been super fun and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks again for listening. Please follow us on Spotify if you're not already so you don't miss any future episodes. We'd also love for you to rate the show while you're there. Connect with us on social. Search Karen Coyne CFP on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. If you have feedback or if we can be of service in any way, please let us know. And now for the standard disclosures.
Any opinions expressed by Joshua Herring are not necessarily those of Raymond James. Raymond James does not endorse and is not affiliated with Joshua Herring or the Longevity Science Foundation. This podcast is for informational purposes only.